October 2, 1945. A polling station in Yokohama. The autumn sun filters through dust-filled air, casting long shadows across a makeshift voting booth erected in what was once a merchant's warehouse. The smell of charred wood still lingers from the firebombing raids 6 months prior. Inside, a Japanese woman in her 30s stands frozen at the entrance, her work-worn hands clutching a canvas bag. She watches, disbelieving, as an American military officer, a woman in uniform, registers another Japanese woman to vote in the upcoming municipal elections. The sight defies everything she has been taught about order, hierarchy, and the natural arrangement of society. For 20 years, she has lived under the rising sun's empire, where women existed in the shadow of their fathers, husbands, and sons. Now, in defeat, the conquerors bring something she cannot name, something that feels simultaneously like chaos and liberation. The transformation of Japan from imperial power to occupied territory occurred with a speed that still bewilders historians. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio waves for the first time in history, announcing surrender in language so formal and archaic that many listeners did not immediately comprehend its meaning. Within weeks, American forces began arriving on Japanese soil, not as the demons that wartime propaganda had promised, but as flesh-and-blood men and women carrying chocolate bars, chewing gum, and something far more revolutionary: ideas about individual rights that would shake the foundations of Japanese society. The supreme commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, arrived with a mandate not merely to occupy, but to remake. His vision was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, to transplant democratic principles into soil that had never known them, to a people whose conception of self existed only in relation to the collective, to the family, to the nation, to the emperor who was himself a living god. The Japanese people braced for annihilation. Their military leaders had warned them that American soldiers would commit unspeakable atrocities, that Japanese women would be violated, that children would be slaughtered, that the ancient culture of Yamato would be erased from the earth. Mothers prepared to kill their own children rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Civilians practiced suicide drills with bamboo spears. The government distributed cyanide capsules. Tokyo radio broadcasts instructed families on the honorable way to die together. This was the expected price of defeat, the inevitable consequence of total war. For a society built upon honor and shame, occupation by a foreign power represented not merely political subjugation but spiritual annihilation, the end of everything that gave life meaning. But the Americans who arrived in September 1945 did not behave as expected. They did not come with swords drawn. They did not burn shrines or desecrate temples. Instead, they came with construction equipment and medical supplies. They distributed food to the starving civilian population: white bread and canned meat and powdered milk that tasted strange on Japanese tongues but filled empty stomachs. They set up field hospitals and vaccinated children against disease. They walked through devastated neighborhoods with cameras and notebooks, documenting the destruction but not gloating over it. Japanese civilians, prepared for death, encountered instead a peculiar American pragmatism mixed with genuine, almost naive idealism. The conquerors seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding rather than merely occupying. This cognitive dissonance created a psychological space where transformation became possible, where old certainties began to crack like rice paper in rain. The most shocking element of American occupation was not military might but social arrangement. Japanese observers noticed immediately that American women in uniform gave orders to men, that they carried rank and authority, that they spoke in planning meetings and expected to be heard. This violated every principle of the Confucian social order that had governed East Asian societies for 2 millennia. In traditional Japanese understanding, women existed in the oku, the inner chambers, while men occupied the omote, the public sphere. Women were to be ryosai kenbo, good wives and wise mothers, their entire purpose defined by service to husband and children. The idea that a woman might exercise political authority, might cast a vote equal to any man's, might shape the direction of society through individual choice rather than familial obligation, this was not merely foreign but incomprehensible. Yet the Americans insisted. On October 11, 1945, MacArthur issued a directive to Prime Minister Kajuro Shidehara outlining 5 reforms necessary for Japan's democratization. The 5th point was unambiguous: grant women the right to vote. The Japanese cabinet received this instruction with something approaching horror. Minister of Home Affairs Yamazaki Iwao protested that Japanese women were unprepared for such responsibility, that they lacked education in political matters, that the family system would collapse if wives could vote independently of their husbands. He argued that democracy itself might be acceptable in Japan, but it must be democracy adapted to Japanese conditions, to Japanese traditions, to the Japanese family structure in which the patriarch decided for all. MacArthur's response was firm. Universal suffrage was non-negotiable. Democracy meant individual rights, and individual rights meant women's suffrage. There would be no compromise on this principle. The vote, to the Americans, was not a privilege granted by government but an inalienable right inherent to personhood. This philosophical position struck Japanese officials as dangerously radical, even anarchic, a recipe for social dissolution. The Japanese government moved slowly, reluctantly, seeking ways to water down or delay the directive. But on December 17, 1945, the election law was revised. For the first time in Japanese history, women gained the legal right to vote and to stand for election. The change happened not through internal social evolution but through external force, the imposed will of a conquering power. This fact complicated the meaning of the reform. Was it liberation or merely another form of subjugation? Could rights granted by occupiers rather than won through struggle ever be authentic? These questions would haunt Japanese feminists for decades. But for millions of ordinary Japanese women in that winter of 1945, the philosophical complexities mattered less than the astonishing reality. They would vote. The first election under the new system was scheduled for April 10, 1946. In the intervening months, American occupation authorities launched an intensive civic education campaign. Military government teams traveled to rural villages carrying film projectors and posters, explaining the mechanics of voting, how to mark a ballot, how to evaluate candidates, how to understand policy positions. They held separate sessions for women, recognizing that many would be too intimidated to attend mixed-gender meetings. American women officers took leading roles in these efforts, serving as living proof that female political participation would not cause social collapse. They spoke in school gymnasiums and community halls, their words filtered through translators, explaining concepts that had no precise equivalents in Japanese: individual conscience, civic duty, the secret ballot. The symbolic object that captured this transformation was the ballot itself, a small slip of paper, marked in private, cast in secret, counted equally. In a society built on visible hierarchies, on known relationships, on transparent obligations, the secret ballot represented something dangerous and exhilarating: privacy, anonymity, the possibility of hidden resistance. A woman might bow to her husband in public, serve him tea with proper deference, speak to him with appropriate humility, and then walk to the polling station and vote against his preferences, against his party, against his entire worldview. No one would know. The ballot was her secret, her rebellion, her small space of absolute freedom. This privacy terrified the guardians of traditional order, for it meant that authority could no longer be enforced through surveillance. A woman's vote could not be policed or controlled. It belonged entirely to her. Over the following years, the shock wore off but the transformation continued. Japanese women used their political voice to advocate for revised family law, for labor protections, for improved education, for social welfare programs. They did not always succeed, and progress was uneven, meeting constant resistance from conservative forces that retained significant power. The 1947 Constitution, drafted under American guidance, enshrined gender equality as a fundamental principle, but social practice lagged far behind legal theory. Women continued to face discrimination in employment, education, and family life. The ideal of the good wife and wise mother retained its cultural power, even as political rights expanded. Yet something had changed permanently. The idea that women were fully human, that they possessed inherent rights independent of familial role, had been introduced into Japanese consciousness. It could not be wholly eradicated, though many tried. The Americans eventually left. The occupation ended in 1952 with the Treaty of San Francisco, and Japan regained its sovereignty. MacArthur departed, his mission accomplished in his own estimation, though historians would debate for decades whether forced democratization could ever be authentic or sustainable. Many Japanese conservatives hoped that with American withdrawal, traditional values would reassert themselves, that the social experiments of the occupation years would be quietly abandoned. Some of those hopes were realized. The emperor remained, his divinity officially renounced but his symbolic importance intact. The Liberal Democratic Party established near-permanent political dominance, pursuing conservative policies while maintaining democratic forms. Japanese society did not become simply a copy of American society. It retained distinctive characteristics, distinctive values, distinctive social arrangements. But women kept voting. They never gave up that right, never surrendered that small slip of paper marked in secret and cast in freedom. The ballot became woven into the fabric of Japanese democracy, taken for granted by generations who could not remember the shock of its arrival. By the 21st century, Japanese women would take for granted political rights that their grandmothers received as an incomprehensible gift from a foreign power. They would debate policy, run for office, serve as ministers and governors and legislators, navigating the persistent gender discrimination of Japanese society while wielding political power that would have been literally unthinkable in 1945. The transformation was incomplete, always contested, frequently frustrating. But it was real. The story of Japanese women's suffrage reveals something essential about democracy itself, that it is not merely a set of institutions or procedures but an idea about human dignity, about who deserves to be heard, about whose voice matters in shaping collective destiny. That idea can be imposed from outside, carried by conquerors, and still take root. It can meet fierce resistance, provoke genuine fear, threaten real values, and still prove durable. The Americans who occupied Japan were not motivated purely by altruism. They sought to remake Japan into a stable ally, to prevent future aggression, to vindicate their own values by proving their universal applicability. Their motives were mixed, their methods sometimes heavy-handed, their understanding of Japanese culture often superficial. They were conquerors, not saviors, however much they preferred the latter narrative. Yet they brought with them, however imperfectly, an idea about human equality that found fertile ground even in defeat's bitter soil. The Japanese women who voted in April 1946 were not puppets of American will, nor were they passive recipients of foreign generosity. They were agents of their own history, seizing an opportunity that had been forced open by circumstances beyond their control, making it their own through courage and persistence. They navigated between tradition and modernity, between obligation and autonomy, between collective identity and individual conscience. They accepted what Americans offered while resisting what Americans assumed. They claimed rights while redefining what those rights meant in Japanese context. This complex negotiation continues still, unfinished, perhaps always unfinished. In the end, the image that remains is the image of that woman in the Yokohama warehouse in October 1945, frozen at the threshold, watching another woman register to vote. She stands at the boundary between two worlds, the world she has always known, with its certainties and hierarchies and defined roles, and a new world whose contours she cannot yet perceive, whose promises and perils remain equally obscure. She does not know what she will decide. She does not know if she will step forward or turn back. History records only that the door was opened, that the possibility was created, that what had been impossible became actual. The ballot became her inheritance, her burden, her opportunity, a small slip of paper that contained multitudes, that promised nothing except the chance to speak, to choose, to matter. That promise, like all democratic promises, would be kept imperfectly, honored partially, contested constantly. But it would never be wholly revoked. In the ruins of empire, in the aftermath of catastrophic war, in the shocked silence of defeat, a new possibility emerged. Not paradise, not utopia, not even justice. Just the difficult, complicated, necessary work of recognizing that every human voice deserves hearing, that every person possesses dignity, that the weakest can speak truth to the powerful if given only the means. The ballot was that means, small, fragile, insufficient, and yet revolutionary. The woman at the threshold would eventually step forward. They all would. And in stepping forward, they would change not only Japan but the very meaning of what it meant to be Japanese, to be a woman, to be a citizen, to be free.